Peter Culp is in studio with us, the former Assistant Attorney General of New York State. Peter, what do you make of what the president said? And did he obstruct justice? Will he get in trouble for it? Do you think Congress will act? So many questions. What do you think?
I mean, their defense is under Article 2. There's no, you break down the two branches. But the classic case of obstructing justice is killing a witness or destroying evidence. In this case, we have Flynn, who's obviously not telling the truth about the evidence that they have. I don't think it'll hold water, much like your reference to Nixon, that the president can't obstruct justice.
And Congress, regardless of whether you want to call it obstructing justice or technically, Congress can, the question for them is it a high crime or misdemeanor? And they get to define essentially what it is in an impeachment proceeding, right?
That's correct. And they can also decide the intent behind the obstruction of justice. If you're trying to hide something from the rest of the people, then they might actually go out. They might be pushed. It's sort of a quasi-political, quasi-judicial circumstance because Congress really can decide, but right now we have the judiciary going after him.
What did you make of the president's lawyer taking the bullet or falling on the sword or whatever metaphor you want to use for this tweet where the president essentially said that he knew about Flynn lying to the FBI before he fired the director of the FBI?
I think they're trying to spin it as he's commenting on a case. Clearly it says, you know, I fired Flynn because of his lies to the FBI. Nobody can argue that. But I think what the lawyer is trying to set him up for is he's just commenting on what happened, not that we actually knew or that Trump knew that he was fired because of what was going on with the FBI.
See, what you're doing right now is like twisting yourself into a pretzel to try to explain what the lawyer was explaining.
That's absolutely right, because I'm not sure. This is a game of, you hear it's chess, not checkers. This seems like Vulcan chess to me. They're trying to play on many different levels and try to figure out what can we say that won't jam him up in the end. And at some point, there's only so many finger pointing that you can do.
Well, by that lawyer, though, taking credit for the tweet, doesn't that erase at least part of the attorney-client privilege that existed between President Trump and the lawyer? Because now the special counsel can say, okay, if you want to take credit for this, we've got some questions for you about that.
Sort of piercing the privilege. I don't know that it would pierce the privilege per se. I do think what it sets up is, well, if you knew that, you must have told Trump that or run it by him at some point, or else you were acting on your own and breaking the confidentiality, right? I mean,
and there's the tweet up there, which I had to fire General Flynn because he lied to the vice president and the FBI. Now, again, the lawyer is suggesting that he wrote this tweet, not the president. And so continue with your point about.
So I think what they're saying is we're commenting on what was said because they're worried if they actually knew and fired Flynn around January, February, I think it was, because of what he said. And they knew that he lied.
And then fired Comey knowing that Flynn lied to the FBI.
Right,
and
right.
That's your obstruction case.
Correct. And that's where you get the nefarious part. It's not necessarily obstruction if it's just you're impeding some investigation. It's more they go after if there's a nefarious part.
But with all that, and to David's point that Congress really gets to decide at what level does a president get impeached? This is a Republican-led Congress. Time after time, they've said what the president is doing is wrong, but we're still going to stand by him. What does he have to do? What smoking gun has to be found for them to say we're going to impeach him?
Well, I think just like Nixon, you keep flipping up the ladder, right, until you get to the point where Congress can no longer defend what's going on.
Wasn't that a Democratic Congress, though, with Nixon?
It was a Democratic Congress.
It was, but when you have the judiciary flipping, first you had Comey, then you have Flynn, and then Flynn's probably going to tell you, well, I spoke to so-and-so at Mar-a-Lago, and so-and-so is going to say, well, Trump told me it was okay to speak to the Russian ambassador and do X, Y, Z. We're going to get up the ladder to the point where Congress is going to say, we have to kind of back off.
Bill Clinton was convicted. They passed an impeachment charge, article of impeachment for obstruction of justice in the U.S. House. That investigation lasted about 7 months until Bill Clinton testified to Ken Starr's grand jury. And then it was 2 months after that when the special counsel, independent counsel, delivered his report to Congress. We're now within that time frame. Do you expect an invitation to go to the Trump White House soon for him to sit down with the special counsel?
I think you maybe have one or two more steps before that. You have Flynn testifying as to who he spoke to at Mar-a-Lago.
Testifying to the grand jury.
Correct. And who he spoke to at Mar-a-Lago. And I'm sure whoever was with Trump at Mar-a-Lago ran it by Trump, and then he said, go ahead. So unless you believe, and this is the part I can't wrap my head around, that Flynn was acting on his own, just doing these things.
But the Trump administration and the Trump's allies argue there's no here. Do you see that argument at all?
As of now, maybe, because you don't really have the details of what Flynn, but if you look at the police statement as to what Flynn is actually saying, he told the FBI and what was actually done, the here is here.
But to Shayna's point, and it's a really smart one, because the big argument against impeaching Bill Clinton was, look, this was an investigation that had already started. It was an investigation into a personal private affair. Yes, he lied under oath, but he lied under oath about something that was personal to begin with. If the charge is that he's obstructing the special counsel investigation, and not that there was any collusion with Russia, doesn't that make it more difficult, and doesn't that bolster the Trump argument that this is essentially chasing their own tail and looking for some gotcha to try and get it?
Yeah, I mean, I think with Clinton, the argument was he's like you said, he's hiding personal stuff. In this one, you're saying that somebody acted with another country to get certain favors, to say, hold off on these sanctions. We're gonna make things
Well, I want
right.
to stop you there, because what if the argument is that he didn't collude with Russia, but that he merely either obstructed the investigation into determining that?
Right, that's what it sounds like, is that, at least from the outset, it doesn't sound like at this point that there's any evidence that Trump got on the phone with Putin and said, let's work together to get me to win, but that later he tried to stop the investigation from happening by firing Comey, and that's what's really being investigated.
But I think just having read some of the facts in this plea agreement with Flynn, he actually does speak to the ambassador.
Flynn does.
Correct.
But we don't know
But
if Trump was involved
he
yet.
reports back to Mar-a-Lago and says, I'm going to go ahead and talk to, and we don't have all the details there, but he actually says that he spoke to somebody, a senior official at Mar-a-Lago, and we have to assume that people aren't acting rogue within the Trump administration on very heavy-duty things.
But let's suppose that, they did have the conversation. They had the conversation. Trump is the president-elect. And let's suppose that he did instruct Flynn to have that conversation, and then Flynn lies about it. Even if they can suggest that Trump somehow then tried to block the investigation into Flynn, again, it wouldn't necessarily be that there was collusion in the call with the Russian ambassador. It would be that in the course of investigating whether there was collusion, President Trump and his team tried to color things up.
Or stop the investigation from happening.
Is it a tough call?
Yeah, I mean, listen, you do make the great point that it is a tough call at this stage. But I really think, having read those points regarding the sanctions, that what he's saying is hold off on doing something while they're negotiating with Obama. Trump is stepping in, or surrogates of Trump stepping in and trying to maneuver or change things, and they shouldn't be. So I think that's the collusion, and then there's all this cover-up. The cover-up is worse than the crime sometimes.
And as we've talked about before, the special counsel, independent counsel report is usually a lot more detailed than any of us have a look at.
They have access to things we could never have access to. Yeah.
Right. Peter Culp, former Assistant Attorney General of New York State. Peter, thanks for coming in. Great to have you as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.